Good morning, depending when you're seeing this. I wanted to share a couple things. So, for most of my life, I believe that one of the smartest things that a person could do is to learn from someone else's mistakes. And this is something that I sort of repeated to myself from time to time, just that it's better to learn a lesson from someone else's mistake than to make that mistake yourself, if possible. And on the surface, it sounds obvious. Why touch a hot stove when you already know exactly what's going to happen, probably based on what someone else has done, and they've burned themselves? Why repeat a mistake that someone else has already paid the price for? And I've thought about this a little bit more. I realized that what I was really trying to do all those years, in sort of thinking about that, wasn't just learning from other people's failures, but what I was actually trying to do also in part of that narrative was to avoid my own mistakes. And those two things are not exactly the same thing. Because when you really dig into it, learning from other people's mistakes doesn't mean that you avoid failure altogether. And this is something I thought about a little bit. It just means that you reduce the cost of failure and reduce the cost to yourself. So you still have to try to take the step, you still have to try something that it is that you are thinking about and feel the discomfort. You just have to do it with a little bit more awareness. And that distinction has completely changed the way that I think about fear and risk, and what it actually means to fail in real life. We tend to talk about failure as this catastrophic event or something big in life, and this is, something it's not irreversible in almost all cases or most cases. Where everything collapses and you permanently are marked by it. But when you really zoom in on most of the decisions that we face in a normal day, very few of them carry this kind of catastrophic consequence. And most of the things we're afraid of don't lead to this total collapse. They lead to a bit of discomfort in many cases, a slightly awkward moment or embarrassment, a tiny hit to the ego, and then life just keeps going. So think about in your life how often you hold back from doing something, not because it's actually dangerous, but because it's uncomfortable. And it could be something like raising your hand or speaking up when you feel like you should, but you also feel like you shouldn't. Having an honest conversation that other people may not want to hear, changing the way that you do your work. And you're not protecting your life in most of these moments. You're protecting your comfort. And that's a very, very different thing. So what if the only thing standing between a better life and the current life that you have is a very small series of survivable discomforts, or even one discomfort? What if the thing that could change your life entirely and the direction of your life, it doesn't require some heroic leap. It's just a willingness to feel awkward, and it might only be for a minute, to feel uncertain for a little bit, or to feel imperfect in front of other people. We treat failure like it's something to be avoided at all costs, and obviously there are, natural reasons for this, and evolution has played a big part. But if you really look at it honestly, there are only a handful of catastrophic failures that you might face in an average life. And, the kind of failures that sort of permanently take something away from you, obviously, real dangers exist where you may not be able to recover from something, even if it's financial catastrophe or something like that. But These are things you know to avoid. But there are real risks in the world, and you know what they are. But realistically, that category is much smaller than our actual fear would have us believe. Most of us label a lot of things with failure, but it really doesn't destroy us. It really is just feedback. And feedback, even when it stings, this is important information. It tells you what has worked. It tells you what didn't work. It tells you where you have made assumptions that were wrong. It tells you what needs to change. And comfort really just tells you that you stayed where you already were before. So I've always liked this idea of learning from other people's mistakes because it feels efficient. It feels like the smart decision. It feels like you're getting the lesson without paying the price. But truthfully, you only really integrate a lesson when your own skin is in the game and at risk in some way. Watching someone else fail, teaches you what can go wrong, but failing yourself really teaches you what it feels like when it does. And that emotional component really, really shapes you. It shapes your mind. And in my own line of work, there are plenty of opportunities to make large mistakes. And there are decisions that affect real people and have real outcomes and consequences. So, of course, there are guardrails. Of course, there are systems in place. And of course, there are moments where, being cautious is the correct thing to do. But inside of that structure, there is still a lot of room for experimentation and some calculated risk taking. There's still room to do things differently, to try new things. And what if failure within this framework is a better way to do something? And that's where the idea of failure becomes practical instead of just philosophical. I can try something a little bit different to get it done faster. I can approach a problem in a new way to see if it leads to a better outcome. And it might not work, it might fall flat, it might cause an embarrassing situation, and it'll do some of these things, but that failure isn't going to cause a massive catastrophic problem. So in most cases, the downside is limited, and the upside, really, making a client happier, learning a more efficient process that affects the way I do things, can be enormous. And that kind of risk is worth taking. Not because it always leads to a win. It might even not lead to a win in most cases, but the loss is survivable. And more importantly, I think it leaves you with information that you did not have before. So most people don't want to fail at most things because they're protecting something fragile in the world. And they avoid failure because they're protecting their self-image. You might feel this. And they don't want to be seen trying and missing at something. They don't want to feel the internal story that tells them that they were not good enough, which comes from their own mind, not the real world. But the story only has power if you start to believe it and believe that your worth is tied to an outcome. So the moment you separate who you are from what you produce and realize these are different things, then you realize failure, most times is just an emotional threat. And that can start to be shed. You can get rid of that feeling, probably by experimenting. So you don't have to live in a fearless way. You just have to be honest about what you're actually risking and ask yourself realistically, What is the worst thing that can happen if something doesn't work out? Not the exaggerated version of what you might be telling yourself, not a catastrophic fantasy. The real one. What's the real outcome? More often than not, the answer is something like embarrassment or disappointment, or just that you've wasted your time and you feel this frustration. So none of these things destroy you, or they destroy things in your life or take things away from you that are permanent. They just make it uncomfortable for a little while. And there's, something strange about that. That discomfort is that discomfort is something that you're trying so hard to avoid, but it's the same discomfort that builds resilience. It's this discomfort that teaches you emotional control. And it's the same discomfort that slowly trains your nervous system, not to just panic and shut down every time something feels uncertain. Avoiding it actually makes you weaker in your mind and in your body. So some of these things to experience will make you stronger. And this is why learning from failure doesn't have to be dramatic or abstract. It can be something incredibly practical. You try, you observe, and you try again in most cases. You try again. You don't need to gamble your entire future benefit from this mindset, but you just need to be willing to tolerate small discomforts in exchange for what is really long-term growth. So what if you just spoke up once more than you normally would? What if you tried an idea that feels slightly outside of your comfort zone, or made a small change in your routine that has a pretty high potential upside and even, a lower downside? Think about that. Even if it doesn't work, what does it actually cost you? A few minutes, maybe? A little bit of your pride, if it's embarrassing, a little bit of self-doubt. But what can it give you? Maybe it'll give you momentum or important insights into something, a new habit, or a completely new direction. So we often wait for confidence before we act on these things, but confidence usually comes from this action, not before it. It comes from realizing over and over again that you survive these outcomes even when they don't go your way. And that realization can probably change the way that you move through the world entirely. You stop navigating like everything is made of glass, and you stop assuming that one wrong move will shatter everything. You start to see yourself as someone who can adapt instead of someone who has to avoid things. So the irony is that people who seem the most confident on the outside are often the ones who have failed the most. And not because failure has given them all of the answers right away, but it has stripped away this illusion that they had to be perfect in order to be okay with themselves. So if you really think about it, most meaningful changes in life, they don't come from massive dramatic moments. They come from these small decisions, repeated consistently, and small risks that have been taken repeatedly. Little bits of courage, small experiments, small risks that have slowly compounded into something much larger over time. The habit of trying is so much more powerful than the fantasy of getting it right the first time. So when we talk about learning from failure, we don't have to frame it like this great philosophy. We can frame it as something extremely practical. Try things that matter to you. Design the risk that you're taking so that the downside is manageable. Pay attention to what happens. Learn from it. So from that, you keep what works, let go of what doesn't, and then you repeat the process. So yes, there will be moments where you should absolutely avoid a certain kind of failure. There are risks that are not worth taking, obviously. There are consequences. But wisdom is knowing the difference. And fear tends to treat everything like it belongs in the same category in our mind. And it makes it difficult, to feel this danger as this life-altering mistake. It makes a small embarrassment feel like this major threat. And this distortion will quietly sort of shrink your life and shrink your character in a lot of ways. So learning from failure is really not about, courting disaster. It's about refusing to let discomfort be the ultimate decision maker in your life. It's about recognizing that most of the things that you're afraid of and that you're afraid to try, they won't take anything meaningful away from you, even if it won't work. So maybe the real lesson here isn't that failure teaches you what works. Maybe it's that failure teaches you who you are when things don't work. Do you shut down? Do you blame others? Do you retreat from a situation? Or do you stay curious? Do you adapt? And you try again with better information? It's okay to be any of those as long as we learn from it and we become a little bit better every time. So that response that you give yourself is probably more important than even the outcome in a specific situation, because outcomes really change. Circumstances change. And the one thing that you carry with you is how you respond to everything in life daily. So as you think about your own life, your habits, your routines, and your goals, I invite you to really look at where you might be overprotecting yourself. I know I'm going to try this, and to learn not from real danger, but from discomfort. Where am I avoiding things? Where is it okay to feel a little bit uncertain and imperfect? And then ask different questions. What if I fail? So what? What if I don't? What if the bigger risk is not making this small mistake and not learning from it and not learning from a missed opportunity? So a little bit of embarrassment and discomfort is worth the lesson in the end, in my view. Not because you stayed safe inside with what you already knew. Failure does not have to be this dark force that you're constantly running from. It can be one of the most practical tools that you have, just like a mirror, to teach us a lesson and an important lesson about ourselves. So most of the time, I am not practicing this, but I know for sure going forward, this is something I'm going to keep it at the forefront, keep thinking about, because the lesson is so much more important than the comfort that I feel from not taking that risk. So I hope that makes sense. Have an awesome day. Bye for now.